On the coldest winter night at 15 degrees, the town went silent. Only wind and heavy snowfall remained. Through that storm, a mother German shepherd dragged her nearly frozen puppies toward the only light she could find. She scratched at a cabin door like a prayer, begging whoever was inside to save her babies. A Navy SEAL opened the door and found her injured, shielding 4 puppies on the edge of death. He stayed awake all night, warming them by hand, refusing to lose even one. By morning, they were breathing again, but the truth behind their suffering was only beginning. If this story moves you, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. At the edge of a northern town where the land climbed into pine and rock and the cold pressed down with a patient, methodical weight, Cole Archer kept his vigil beside the stove. He was 40, tall at roughly 6'1", broad-shouldered in the quiet, practical way of a man who trained because it kept him steady rather than because it made him look formidable. His face carried the kind of American masculinity that did not ask for attention. Sharp angles, a strong jaw, clean-shaven, the faintest silver threading his dark brown hair at the temples where time had touched him first. The hair itself was cut in a neat undercut, a habit he had never bothered to unlearn after leaving the teams. His eyes, blue-gray and deep-set, had learned to rest on rooms as if they were maps. He wore what he always wore, long-sleeved camouflage tucked into matching trousers, a dark tactical belt with a pouch and a holster that suggested tools rather than weapons, tan high-collar boots built for ice and stone, and on his wrist a black-faced steel watch that caught the firelight with a muted, expensive glint. The cabin was spare by design. Table, chair, stove, a narrow cot pushed against the wall, each object placed with purpose, as if clutter itself were a risk. Outside, the wind combed the hillside, and the thermometer nailed beside the door had fallen to -15 Celsius. Cole had learned long ago that cold like this did not shout. It settled, and if you did not answer it correctly, it simply took what it wanted. He sat with one elbow on his knee, the other hand feeding a split log into the stove, listening to the soft clicks of metal as heat moved through iron. He did not think of his past in words anymore, only in habits, counting breaths before sleep, checking exits without looking, flinching only inwardly when the wind slammed the eaves. The cold made his right shoulder ache, a souvenir from a mission that had ended in a blast he could still feel when weather turned mean. It had taught him, along with other losses he did not rehearse, the cost of waiting too long. He had chosen this cabin because from its small porch he could see the lights of town below like a handful of distant stars, close enough to belong, far enough not to intrude. The night was clean, moonlight painting silver lines across the snow, when a sound threaded through the storm. Thin, deliberate, wrong for wind. A scratch, not the frantic skitter of branches, not the dull thud of falling ice, but the small, patient drag of something alive. Cole's posture changed before his thoughts did. He stood, boots already on, jacket pulled from the peg without turning on the light. The sound came again, softer, as if whoever made it were conserving energy. He paused with his hand on the latch, feeling the grain of the scarred wood under his palm, letting the moment tell him what it would. He had learned to respect thresholds. Outside, the wind hissed like a held breath. He opened the iron door. Cold rushed in like a living thing, stealing warmth from the room behind him, snow stinging his cheeks. At first he saw only movement and dark. Then his eyes adjusted, and the shape resolved. A German shepherd stood at the edge of the porch, large even in collapse, her black and tan coat dusted with frost, her ears struggling to stay upright through exhaustion. She had the disciplined stillness of a working dog, the squared muzzle, the gaze that did not waste energy on noise. She did not bark, she did not whine. She stood angled against the wind, her body forming a wall around 4 smaller forms at her feet. They were puppies, barely weeks old, their fur wet with melted snow, their bodies drawn into themselves as if the cold had tried to fold them back into the dark. They looked at first glance like they might already be gone. Then Cole saw it. The smallest of motions, a tremor under fur, the faintest shiver that meant life had not yet been persuaded to leave. He crouched, keeping his movements slow, voice low and steady, as if sound itself could warm them. "You found the right door," he said, not because he expected her to understand the words, but because his own body needed the ritual of speaking to keep from rushing and making a mistake. Up close, the damage was undeniable. The mother's breath steamed in ragged bursts. One foreleg quivered at an unnatural angle, and beneath the thick coat he could make out the pale lines of old scars that spoke of restraint and hard training. There was a raw band around her neck where a collar had once bitten too deep, healed into rope-like tissue. When his gloved hand brushed her flank, he felt the heat leaving her, the cold already winning. The puppies were worse, rigid with hypothermia, their tiny chests moving only when life remembered itself. Cole did not think in panic. He thought in steps. Passive rewarming first. No direct heat that could shock bodies already struggling to keep rhythm. He slid one arm under the dog's chest and another beneath her hindquarters. She was heavier than she looked, all muscle and endurance, and utterly spent. For a second his boots slipped on the packed snow, and he nearly went down with her. Then his footing held. He carried her backward into the cabin, kicked the door shut with his heel, sealing the storm outside. The sudden quiet rang. He lowered her near the stove, laying her gently on the wooden floor, spreading a blanket beneath her without restricting her movement. Her eyes stayed on him, dark and assessing, not pleading. There was intelligence there, and something thinner but deliberate, trust, extended like a line he could choose to hold or drop. He placed the puppies between layers of wool, not touching the iron, rotating them carefully, rubbing their tiny bodies with the slow, firm strokes he had used once on men pulled from water too cold to forgive. He wrapped warmed water bottles in towels and tucked them near, not against, their cores. He spoke softly, a dry humor threading through the urgency, because he had learned that calm could be contagious. "No storms in here," he told them, "just a stove and some stubborn biscuits." The mother's ears flicked. She did not resist when he tended her leg, did not snap when he adjusted the blanket, only tensed and then forced herself into stillness, as if discipline were a language she trusted more than comfort. He worked in cycles, warm, check, adjust, counting breaths, watching color return in increments, so small they would have been invisible to anyone not looking for them. Outside, the wind continued its assault. Inside, time took on a different shape. At roughly a third of the night, when fatigue threatened to make his hands clumsy, the dog did something that broke his rhythm. She shifted, dragging her injured leg with care, and pressed her nose against his wrist, then angled her head toward the door. The gesture was not frantic. It was precise, purposeful, as if she were pointing to a coordinate only she could see. For a heartbeat, the old instincts in him misfired. Had someone followed her? Was there another body in the cold? He rose, listening. The storm answered with its indifferent roar. No footsteps, no voices. When he knelt again, she watched him with that same measured focus, then relaxed, satisfied, as if the act itself mattered more than its outcome. It struck him then, with the quiet force of recognition, that this was not coincidence. This was intent carried on failing legs through a night that would have turned most creatures back long before reaching this place. The thought did not arrive with mysticism, only with a kind of moral weight. He had opened a door. Something had chosen him to be on the other side of it. The night wore on. He did not sleep. He moved from puppy to puppy, rotating them through the warmest places, monitoring breath, watching for the moment when a body would stop fighting and require a different kind of help. The smallest one let out a sound like a thread breaking, then took a deeper breath and settled into a rhythm. Another's gums went from gray to a tentative pink. Cole felt the familiar tightening behind his ribs, the echo of nights when he had waited for signs like this from men who had no more words to give. He did not let the memories take over. He fed the stove, careful not to scorch the air. He talked, not to fill the silence, but to shape it. "You're here," he told the dog, more to himself than to her. The mother endured, jaw set, eyes fixed on some point beyond the ceiling, pain acknowledged and then put aside, as if it were simply another condition of the job. In the pre-dawn, when the world outside went from black to a thinner blue, he noticed the change he had been working toward all night. The puppy's breathing had evened, each tiny chest rising and falling with a steadiness that felt like a promise. He sat back on his heels, the first true exhale of the night, leaving him in a long, controlled release. Outside, the wind still howled. Inside, life had chosen to stay. He reached for another blanket, careful, almost reverent in the way he arranged it. The dog met his gaze, and for a moment there was something like understanding in the space between them. Not sentiment, not magic, but the shared recognition of a line crossed and held. The cold had not won. Not tonight. He did not know what would come in the morning, what questions would follow, or what truths might surface if he traced the scars on her neck back to their source. He only knew that when the sound had come to his door, thin as a thread in a blizzard, he had answered. And in the answering, something in him that had been held at arm's length for years had stepped forward again, quiet and certain, ready to do the next right thing without needing to know where it would lead. Morning broke without ceremony, the kind of pale northern light that made snow look less like grief and more like a page waiting for ink. Cole loaded the mother dog and her 4 pups into the back of his truck with the same deliberate care he had used all night, each movement measured so as not to jolt bodies that were still deciding whether they trusted the world again. The road down from his cabin curled through pine and rock, and the town lay at its foot like a held breath. He drove with both hands steady on the wheel, eyes blue-gray and intent, the black face of his steel watch ticking time he could not afford to waste. The mother, large, black and tan, scars mapping a life that had asked too much of her, lifted her head once when the truck took a sharper turn, then settled, guarding the bundled shapes that shifted faintly under wool. The smallest made a thin sound like a thread being pulled through cloth. Cole answered it without looking back. "We're almost there." The clinic stood near the edge of town, a low building with wide windows that caught the morning and returned it in bands across stainless steel and pale tile. He carried the mother in first, then the puppies, his boots leaving half-moon prints on the mat as he crossed a threshold that smelled of disinfectant and something gentler beneath it. Clean warmth, the promise of help. Avery Quinn met him at the door. She was in her late 30s, tall without being imposing, her build spare in the way of people who walked a lot and stood longer. Dark brown hair was pulled into a low practical knot at the nape of her neck, a few strands already escaping as if they had never agreed to stay put. Her skin was pale but warm-toned, marked by the fine lines of long nights and longer days. When she focused, a faint crease appeared between her brows, the only visible sign of the weight she carried for the lives that passed through her hands. She wore a white veterinary blouse over a gray turtleneck, dark scrub pants, and black non-slip shoes. Her eyes, steady and intelligent, took in the scene in a single sweep, the mother's posture, the puppy's stillness, the way Cole held them, as if his arms were instruments rather than muscle. "Hypothermia," she said quietly, not as a guess, but as a map. "We'll start passive rewarming. No shock." Her voice was calm, the kind that did not rise even when the room did. She had learned early in her career that panic traveled faster than any disease. 2 technicians moved in behind her, efficient, gentle, their questions few and precise. Avery's hands were warm when she took the first puppy, her touch firm enough to be useful and soft enough not to startle a body that had learned to flinch. She checked gums, temperature, reflex. Severe cold stress, she said, more to the process than to the people. Light frostbite on the ears and paws. They're alive. The last two words were not a flourish. They were a promise she intended to keep. The mother did not resist as Avery examined her leg, did not bare teeth when the old collar scar was revealed in the clean light. She watched everything, amber eyes following each hand with the precision of a professional. When a technician approached too quickly, she shifted, just a fraction, placing her body between the puppies and the movement. Cole noticed, and so did Avery. "She's disciplined," Avery murmured, as if naming a language. "That kind of restraint isn't instinct alone." She slid a thermometer into place, read it, nodded once. "We'll warm them slowly. Warmed fluids, humidified oxygen. They'll stay in the incubator overnight." Cole stood back when asked, the familiar tension in his shoulders loosening only enough to allow work to happen. He did not hover, but he did not leave. He leaned against the counter, the lines of his jaw set, eyes tracking every step like a man who had learned the cost of not watching. It was while Avery prepared the incubator that the mundane details began to gather their meaning. The microchip reader passed over the mother's shoulder with a small, efficient beep. Avery's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to the dog. "She's registered," she said. "Local." Cole felt the word settle in his chest. Local meant history, and history meant answers that were rarely gentle. The puppies were placed in the warmed chamber one by one, wrapped in layers that let heat do its patient work. Their breathing did not change dramatically. It did not need to. It simply continued, each breath a quiet act of defiance. Avery turned to Cole. "They'll need the night," she said. "You did exactly what you should have done. No direct heat, no rushing. They've got a chance because of that." He nodded, the relief in his posture more visible than any smile would have been. He gave the mother a look that was half gratitude, half something like apology for the world she had learned to endure. "You hear that?" he said softly. "You got 'em here." The dog met his gaze without blinking. They stood at the glass for a while. The smallest pup twitched, then stilled, then twitched again, as if remembering a dream it had not yet learned to hold. In the quiet, a sliver of humor found its way through the gravity. When Cole shifted his boots, something tugged at his ankle. He looked down to find one of the pups, Maple he would later call her, had somehow extricated herself just enough to clamp her mouth around the toe of his tan boot. Not a bite, an embrace. She held on with a stubbornness that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so endearing. "We're keeping the boots," Avery said dryly. "They've decided." The corner of Cole's mouth lifted, the kind of smile that arrived rarely and stayed briefly. He crouched and let Maple have her victory, easing his foot free only after she tired of the effort and settled back into warmth with a small, satisfied huff. Avery moved to the computer at the counter, fingers quick and quiet as she pulled up the microchip record. The name of the registered owner appeared, followed by an address in town. The vaccination history stopped halfway through a line that should have continued. Avery's brow furrowed, not with drama, but with the practiced concern of someone who had learned to recognize patterns before they declared themselves. "Records are incomplete," she said. "Missed boosters. No recent visits?" She glanced at Cole, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that suggested both empathy and a boundary. "If the owner shows up and demands them, this becomes complicated. The law favors ownership unless there's evidence of neglect or abuse. Medical findings can support that, but it's stronger if there's context. Photos, witnesses, Anything that shows these animals were put at risk. She did not raise her voice. She did not soften the truth. She trusted him with it. They stepped into the back room while the technicians monitored the incubator. The mother dog lay on a padded mat, a light bandage securing her leg, fluids dripping steadily into her vein. Her breathing had eased into something closer to normal, each rise of her rib cage less labored than the last. She watched Cole as he approached, her gaze tracking his movement the way a compass tracks north. He knelt beside her, careful to keep his presence calm and unthreatening. "You did good," he said, words chosen not for poetry, but for accuracy. "We'll figure the rest out." She flicked an ear, a gesture so small it might have been coincidence, and then did something that made both of them still. She turned her head and pressed her nose to the inside of his wrist, right where his watch met skin, and held it there for a count of 3. Not seeking warmth, not asking for food. Simply touching, as if marking a coordinate only she and he could read. Avery's breath caught in a way she would, later insist, was nothing. Cole felt the contact like a question he did not yet have language for. Then the dog withdrew, satisfied, eyes returning to the door behind which her pups slept. It was a small moment, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it, but it rearranged something in the room. The world had a way of offering signs that were not meant to convince so much as to orient. By midday, the puppy's vitals had stabilized enough to let the waiting become something other than fear. Avery offered coffee that tasted like it had been thinking about being strong rather than committing to it. They spoke of practical things, dosage, warming protocols, how long to wait before attempting a first feeding. Only then did Avery ask, gently, the question that had been hovering since the microchip had spoken. "Do you want me to call the owner?" Cole considered. The cabin, the scratch at the door, the way the mother had stood against the wind with 4 bodies she could barely keep. Warm. He thought of the scars under her fur, of discipline learned where gentleness had been absent. "Not yet," he said. "Let's make sure they're out of danger first." Avery nodded. She was not a woman who rushed into confrontation. She preferred the solid ground of preparation. "We'll document everything," she said. "Temperature readings, injuries, the condition they arrived in. If we need to protect them, we will." Night returned with less ferocity than the one before, but the cold did not forget its work. Cole stayed at the clinic longer than visiting hours, sitting on the narrow bench outside the incubator room, the mother's steady breathing a metronome behind him. He gave names to the pups not because they needed them yet, but because naming was a way of telling the universe he intended to keep track. Spruce for the one with the dark blaze along his spine, maple for the thief of boots, cedar for the curious one who tested every boundary, aspen for the quiet smallest who listened before moving. He called the mother Willow because even injured she had bent without breaking, a living shelter in a storm. The names settled into him as if they had been waiting. At some point, when fatigue finally pressed its thumb to the back of his neck, he stood to leave, trusting the machines and the people who knew them better than he ever would. He paused at the door, looking back through the glass. The pups lay like commas in a sentence that had not yet finished writing itself. Willow lifted her head, eyes finding his. For a moment there was no clinic, no town, no cold. There was only a line drawn between 2 beings who had answered each other in the dark. By the time the night staff took over, the first of the puppies opened an eye, just a sliver, just enough to let the light in. It was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no sudden movement, only a quiet widening, as if the world had been invited back into a small, determined body. Avery watched it happen from the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. "They're coming back," she said, not as a promise, but as an observation rooted in science, and something else she did not name. Cole nodded once, the motion containing more than any words he might have offered. Outside, snow fell in patient lines, lighter now, almost cautious, as if the storm itself were willing to step aside and see what would follow. Cole did not return to the cabin after leaving the clinic. The light outside had thinned into that northern blue that made every surface honest, and honesty, he had learned, was best met before it hardened into night. He drove toward the address the microchip had offered, then passed it because the woman at the front desk had also offered something quieter, a name the town did not like to say aloud: Hank Doolin. The road narrowed as it followed Northlight Creek, a ribbon of dark water cutting through ice. Pines leaned over the banks, their branches carrying the weight of last night's storm. The warehouse appeared where the gravel thinned into mud, a low structure with a sagging roof and a door that did not close so much as pretend to. Cole parked where his tires would not leave too much of a story behind and stepped out into air that still burned the lungs. He moved the way men do who have learned that the first thing a place will give you is what it wants you to see. He did not take that gift. He took his time. Inside, the smell told the truth before his eyes did. Damp straw, cold metal, the sour edge of neglect. A single bulb hung from a wire near the door, unlit, and light fell through the gaps in the boards in pale, accusing stripes. He knelt. The straw had been disturbed, flattened in a wide oval, as if a body had curled there repeatedly, trying to keep something small alive. A metal bowl lay on its side, a film of ice locking the last water into a useless shape. Near the back wall, a length of chain lay half buried in chaff, its links reddened with rust, the end fitted with a clasp that had been opened and closed too many times to be gentle. Cole photographed everything. He did not rush. He framed the bowl against the floorboards, the straw against the wall, the chain against his glove for scale. He checked the temperature with a small probe, noted the reading, and marked the coordinates on his phone. The work steadied him, the way it always had. In the absence of noise, facts spoke. He stepped outside and circled the building, eyes on the ground. Snow still held the night's language, the scuff of boots, the long drag of something heavy, a series of paw prints that began at the door and angled toward the creek before disappearing into drift. He followed them to where the bank dipped and the ice had been broken recently, the dark water licking at the edges. A man had stood here, he thought. A dog had turned back. Cole did not need to imagine the rest. He had learned in other places that neglect did not announce itself with cruelty alone. Sometimes it was simply the absence of care, repeated until absence became harm. A voice behind him startled the quiet. "You're not hunting, are you?" It belonged to a woman whose age the cold had softened rather than hardened. She stood at the edge of the tree line, bundled in a quilted coat, a knit cap pulled low over silver hair that escaped in soft curls. Her face was narrow, lines etched by winters rather than worry, and her eyes were sharp with the kind of kindness that did not mistake itself for permission. "I saw your truck," she said. "Figured I'd ask before the rumors did." Cole introduced himself, kept it simple. She nodded, the way people do when they already know a story and are waiting to see if you do too. "Name's Ruth Calder," she said. "I've lived up the bend since before that place was a place." She gestured with a mitten toward the warehouse. "Belongs to Hank, or used to. He comes and goes, mostly goes." Her mouth tightened, not in anger but in a kind of weary accounting. "I heard them, nights like last night, not barking, just small sounds, like someone trying not to be heard." Cole did not interrupt. He let the space do what it needed to do. "I brought soup once," Ruth continued. "Knocked, no answer, left it by the door. It was still there the next day, frozen solid." She shook her head. "You can tell when a place isn't being tended. Even the snow knows." He asked if she would be willing to say this again later to someone who would write it down. She studied his face as if measuring whether he would carry the words carefully. "If it helps those animals," she said, "I'll say it twice." Cole returned to the interior, guided now by the certainty that comes when a story begins to align. He took close-ups of the wall where the chain had scraped, the faint dark on the boards where something had bled and then frozen. He documented the bowl again, this time with a ruler placed beside it. Outside, the creek murmured under ice, the sound of movement beneath restraint. He was bagging a length of the rusted chain when a low pressure settled behind his eyes, the kind that had once meant incoming fire and now meant something else he had not learned to name. He turned. Willow stood in the doorway. He had not heard her approach. The snow had taken her sound. She was moving more easily. Today, the bandage on her leg clean against her fur, her amber eyes alert. He had left her in the truck with the heat running and the window cracked. She had decided, apparently, that waiting was no longer acceptable. She did not come to him. She angled past, nose low, moving through the space as if reading a map only she could see. She paused at the straw, inhaled, then walked to the back wall and stopped. There, half hidden beneath a stack of warped pallets, lay something that did not belong to the building. An old leather collar cracked with age, its metal tag bent, the inside edge dark with a stain that did not belong to rust alone. Willow did not touch it. She sat. The act was precise, deliberate, as if she were pointing with her whole body. For a moment, Cole felt the room tilt, not with mysticism, but with the clarity that sometimes follows an answer arriving before a question has been fully asked. He photographed the collar in place, then lifted it carefully with a gloved hand. The leather was stiff with dried blood. The tag bore no name, only a number worn thin by time. He bagged it, heart steady, because steadiness was the only way to hold what came next. Outside, Ruth watched from a distance, one mitten pressed to her mouth. "I always thought there was more back there," she said when he joined her. Cole did not trust his voice. He trusted the evidence. He drove from the warehouse to the edge of town, where the gas station crouched like a bright island against the snow. Inside, warmth hummed, and the clerk, a young man with a tired face and a beard that had not been trimmed in weeks, looked up with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to ask questions unless the answers were necessary. "Can I help you?" Cole asked about security footage. The clerk shrugged. "Depends what you need." Cole explained enough: an animal, a storm, a timeline that mattered. The clerk's expression shifted, something like recognition, flickering behind the caution. "We had a guy in here late," he said. "Bought whiskey, said his truck wouldn't start in the cold. Name on the card was Doolin." He turned the monitor so Cole could see. The footage was grainy, time-stamped just after midnight. A man in a heavy brown coat stood at the counter, shoulders sagging, jaw unshaven, eyes dulled by more than exhaustion. He paid, left, returned for a second bottle. On the way out, he paused, looking past the glass as if the dark itself were a mirror. Cole saved the clip, noting the time, the angle, the sequence. It was not a confession. It was better. It was a piece that fit. By the time he returned to the warehouse, the light had begun to slip, the blue thinning toward gray. He walked the perimeter once more, marking the places where snow had been disturbed, where a heavy object had been dragged. He imagined, without indulging, the decision that had been made here, to leave a mother and her young to weather, to believe. That cold could be outsourced to silence. He did not let anger take the lead. Anger was loud. What he needed was a record that could not be argued away. He met Ruth again near the tree line and took her statement on his phone, her voice steady, even when the words were not. She did not dramatize. She did not need to. When he finished, he thanked her. She waved the thanks away. "Just don't let it go back to being quiet," she said. "Quiet's how this happened." As they spoke, Willow stood a few paces away, her body angled toward the creek, ears tracking something that had nothing to do with them. Cole followed her gaze. The water had opened a narrow channel through the ice, dark and patient. In that direction lay the town. In that direction lay the office of the animal control officer Avery had mentioned. In that direction lay the line between what had been endured and what would be answered. They walked back to the truck as the first stars began to test the sky. Willow moved, with a purpose that no longer needed coaxing. She paused once at the edge of the bank and looked back at Cole, then forward again, as if confirming that he understood the route. He did. The path was not a mystery anymore. It was a sequence. Evidence, witness, time-stamped record. The law was not a storm. It was a current. If you knew where to step, it would carry you. He opened the door for her, careful of her leg, and she climbed in with a quiet dignity that made the act feel like a vow. As he drove, the last of the light caught in the steel of his watch and flashed once, like a signal. He did not believe in omens. He believed in patterns. And the pattern now was clear. Somewhere between the scratch at his door and the collar beneath the pallets, a line had been drawn. He intended to follow it until it ended. Cole chose the bar because it was where the town went when it wanted to forget the cold. It sat at the bend of Route 9, a low building with windows fogged by breath and beer, its sign creaking like a tired hinge in the wind. He arrived before the dinner rush, when the room still held the quiet of a place that had not yet decided what kind of night it would be. Willow remained in the truck with the heater set low and a blanket tucked around her shoulders. She watched him through the windshield with the steady focus of a dog who had learned that waiting was sometimes part of the work. Inside, the air smelled of fried onions and old wood. The bartender, a broad woman with cropped hair and forearms etched by years of lifting kegs, nodded once at Cole without asking what he wanted. He took a seat at the far end where he could see the door. Men like Hank Doolan did not arrive quietly. They announced themselves with sound before presence, with laughter too loud for the size of the room, or silence too heavy to be ignored. Hank came with both. He was in his early 40s, thick through the shoulders from work that had once been honest, now softened by nights like this. A stubble of dark beard shadowed his jaw, and a scar split the skin above his left eyebrow, old and poorly healed. His coat was a size too large, the sleeves stained at the cuffs, and when he shook snow from it, the flakes fell with a kind of resignation. He did not see Cole at first. He went to the bar, ordered whiskey, drank half in one swallow, then turned, eyes narrowing as if the room itself had rearranged. Recognition flickered, followed by something harder. He walked over and stopped close enough that Cole could smell the cold on him, the alcohol riding it like a second breath. "You got my dog," Hank said. Not a question. The words were blunt, ownership pressed into each syllable. Cole did not rise. He did not offer his hand. He met Hank's stare the way he had met men in other rooms, in other countries, without threat, without apology. "She walked into my cabin in a blizzard," he said evenly. "With 4 pups, hypothermic." Hank's jaw tightened. "She's mine," he said again, louder this time, as if volume could substitute for proof. "I don't care where she went." Cole let the words settle, then placed his phone on the table between them, screen dark. "What you care about isn't the question," he said. "What the law cares about is neglect that puts animals in danger. That's not a gray area." Hank's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Cole. He snorted, a sound that was half laugh, half challenge. "You think you know what you're talking about?" Cole kept his voice low. He did not use the tone of command. He used the tone of consequence. "I know what a vet documented this morning," he said. "Severe hypothermia, frostbite on the ears and paws, old abrasions around her neck, a warehouse with no heat, frozen water, a chain." Hank's lips curled. "I kept them in the shed so they wouldn't run," he said, leaning in. "It was warmer than outside." The words came out fast, careless, the way truth sometimes does when it believes itself unchallenged. Something in Cole's posture shifted, not visible to anyone but those who had learned to read bodies as language. His thumb brushed the side of the phone. The recording icon lit silently. One-party consent, Avery had reminded him. The law did not require permission here. It required accuracy. Hank continued, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness. "I was going to deal with it when the storm passed," he said. "Dogs are tough. She's always been tough." Cole nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the record now being made. "They were dying," he said. Hank's eyes flared. "Don't tell me what they were," he snapped. "You don't get to take what's mine." The bartender glanced over, then looked away, the way people do, when they sense a boundary being tested but do not yet know which side will hold. Cole leaned back slightly, opening the space between them. He did not raise his voice. "I'm not taking anything," he said. "I'm preventing harm. If you show up at the clinic demanding them back, you will be met with a report, not an argument." Hank laughed, sharp and humorless. "You and your paperwork," he said. "I'll go down there tonight." Cole met his gaze. "If you do, you'll be doing it with a record of what you just said." For a moment, something like calculation crossed Hank's face. Then bravado returned, the old armor. He took another swallow of whiskey, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "We'll see," he said. He turned away, leaving the words behind him, like spent shells. Cole did not move until the door slammed, and the cold rushed in, then out again. He ended the recording, labeled the file, and slid the phone into his pocket. He did not linger. He stepped outside into dusk that had already begun to choose night. Willow lifted her head the moment he approached, ears pricked, body alert. He opened the door and rested a hand against her shoulder. "We're not done," he murmured, more to himself than to her. She breathed out, a long, steadying sound. He drove back toward town, the road darkening as the light thinned, and dialed the numbers he had saved earlier. Dr. Avery Quinn answered first, her voice calm but edged with the fatigue of someone who had stayed late too many nights for animals that could not speak for themselves. "I have more," Cole said. He summarized, not dramatizing. Avery listened, then said, "I'll add the audio to the file. We need the county officer." He hung up and called the number Avery provided. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered, clear and direct. "Maya Ortiz." Cole pictured her from the name alone, and then corrected himself when she arrived on the line in full. She was in her mid-30s, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who had chosen a job that demanded both backbone and compassion. When they met later, he would note the details. Tall but not imposing, hair black and pulled into a low, practical ponytail, skin the color of late summer, eyes that did not blink first in difficult conversations. "I'm the county animal welfare officer," she said now. "Tell me what you have." Cole laid out the sequence. The blizzard, the mother at his door, the clinic, the warehouse, the neighbor's statement, the collar, the gas station footage, the bar. He did not editorialize. He offered facts like stones placed in a line. There was a pause on the other end, then a breath. "That's enough for an emergency hold," Maya said. "We can prevent any removal until a hearing." Relief did not rush him. It settled, measured. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Email everything tonight," she said. "I'll open a case. If he comes to the clinic, they are not to release the animals. If he comes to you—" She stopped, then continued, choosing her words carefully. "Do not escalate. Document." Cole glanced at Willow. "Understood." He ended the call as the last light slipped behind the ridge. They reached the cabin as the first stars pricked the sky. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a smell of snow that was not yet falling but was already present in the air. Cole lit the stove, fed it until the room warmed, then set his laptop on the table. He uploaded the photographs, the audio file, the gas station clip, Ruth's statement. He wrote the timeline in clean, spare lines. Willow paced once, twice, then stopped by the door, ears angled, body taut. He noticed it because he had learned to notice what others dismissed as restlessness. "What is it?" he asked softly. She did not bark. She did not whine. She simply stood there, as if listening to a frequency beyond human hearing. The wind rose, then fell. Somewhere down the slope, an engine coughed, then went quiet. Cole did not reach for a weapon. He reached for his phone. He sent a brief message to Maya. File uploaded, all evidence attached. He did not move Willow from the door. If her instincts were a compass, he would not interfere with the direction. A light appeared between the trees, one headlamp, then two, cutting slow arcs through the dark. Willow's posture did not change, but her eyes did, narrowing with a focus that was neither fear nor aggression. Cole stood beside her, hand resting lightly against her back. He did not open the door. He did not speak. He waited, listening to the night decide what it would bring. The lights did not approach the cabin. They turned, receded, vanished behind the ridge. The wind carried their absence back to him like a held breath finally released. Cole exhaled. He did not tell himself that the moment meant anything more than what it was. He had learned the cost of reading signs. Into silence. Still, he could not shake the sense that lines were being drawn in places no one would later remember were once empty. He checked his phone. A message from Maya blinked into view. "Emergency hold filed. Clinic notified. He will not get them back tonight." Cole closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words land where the day's edges had cut. Willow turned from the door and walked to the hearth, lowering herself with a carefulness that still spoke of her injury. He knelt and placed another log on the fire. "We're doing this right," he said. She watched him, amber eyes reflecting the flame, a dog who had learned that safety was not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who did not turn away. Outside, the wind worried the eaves, testing what had been set in place. Inside, the record existed. The call had been made. The night could do what it would. They would answer it with what they had. Snow did not fall the morning of the hearing. It hovered. The kind of cold that did not dramatize itself, but pressed quietly into everything. By the time Cole parked outside the town hall, the building already glowed with a soft yellow light that made the drifts along the steps look gentler than they were. Northlight was not a large place. When something mattered here, people did not need to be invited. They arrived because absence would have felt like a kind of consent. Inside, the hall smelled of old wood and coffee. A bulletin board by the entrance had been turned into something else overnight. Children's drawings taped at uneven angles, crayons bright against winter. Paws, hearts, the words "Be kind," spelled with the earnest crookedness of hands still learning how to make letters stand straight. Avery Quinn stood near the double doors that led to the chamber, tall and composed in a charcoal coat, her dark hair pulled back in a practical twist that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She had the look of a woman who knew how to carry responsibility without letting it make her brittle. When she saw Cole, she nodded once, a greeting that was also reassurance. "Maya's inside," she said quietly. "She's ready?" Cole followed her in. The room had been arranged for a hearing, not a spectacle. Folding chairs formed neat rows, the long table at the front cleared of anything that might suggest theater. Maya Ortiz stood near the clerk's desk, a folder in her hands, posture straight, eyes focused with the calm intensity of someone who understood both the law and the cost of applying it. She wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse, hair still tied in the low ponytail Cole had noticed before, her expression neither warm nor cold, simply prepared. To one side sat Ruth Calder, hands folded in her lap, quilted coat folded over the back of her chair. She had dressed as if for church, not because the room demanded it, but because the moment did. Across the aisle, a handful of townspeople had taken seats, quiet and attentive. There was no murmur, only the soft scrape of chairs as people settled. Cole took a seat near the aisle, Willow at his side on a short lead, her bandaged legs steady beneath her, amber eyes moving through the room with a composure that felt older than training. She did not strain toward anyone. She did not hide. She simply existed, a presence that made the air feel more honest. Hank Doolan arrived late, coat still dusted with snow, jaw set in a way that looked less like resolve than refusal. He took his seat without meeting anyone's eyes, the scar above his brow catching the light for a moment before the room stilled. The clerk called the hearing to order. The judge entered, a woman in her early 50s with hair pulled into a severe bun, lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of long days rather than easy judgments. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the evenness of someone who did not mistake, neutrality for indifference. This is a temporary hearing regarding the custody and welfare of a canine and her 4 puppies, she said. The question before us is not ownership in perpetuity, but immediate safety. Maya rose first. She did not dramatize, she did not hurry. She presented the facts as one might place stones across a stream, each one set where it could be tested by weight. Photographs of the warehouse interior, straw matted with damp, the bowl encased in ice, the chain against the wall. Temperature readings taken at the site. Medical reports from Avery documenting severe hypothermia, early frostbite on ears and paws, old abrasions around the mother's neck consistent with prolonged restraint. Ruth's statement, read aloud in her own words, simple and unadorned. The nights, the sounds, the soup left untouched. The collar recovered beneath the pallets, photographed in situ, then sealed. The gas station footage showing Hank's purchases during the blizzard. Finally, the audio recording from the bar, Hank's own voice, casual in its certainty, acknowledging the warehouse, the intent to leave them there until the storm passed. When it was Hank's turn, he stood with the stiffness of a man who had rehearsed his defense in the quiet places of his mind and found it lacking when spoken aloud. He argued that the dogs were his, that hardship did not equal cruelty, that storms were acts of God. His voice rose and fell, catching on words that might have carried him if the room had not already learned to listen differently. The judge asked questions that were neither gentle nor unkind. You acknowledge leaving them without heat, without accessible water, during a blizzard? Hank's mouth tightened. I thought they'd be fine, he said. The words did not sound like belief. They sounded like habit. She rose, slowly, carefully, mindful of her leg, and took 2 measured steps forward. She did not bark. She did not growl. She lifted her muzzle and looked at the judge, not with pleading, but with a steadiness that felt almost like a question. Will you see what is already here? The room seemed to hold its breath. Cole's hand hovered near her collar, ready to guide her back if needed, but the judge raised one finger, not to command, but to acknowledge. It's all right, she said softly. Willow stopped where she was, a quiet center in a room full of human language. The moment passed without spectacle, but something in it rearranged the space. People would later say they could not explain why that single, wordless act had mattered. They would only say that it had. The judge returned her attention to the record. The standard today is immediate welfare, she said. On that standard, the evidence is sufficient. She issued the order with clarity. Temporary removal of the animals from Hank Doolan's custody. Placement with Northlight Shelter under the supervision of Dr. Avery Quinn, a no-contact provision. preventing Hank from approaching the animals or the shelter pending a full hearing, and a directive for follow-up evaluations. There was no gavel strike that sounded like triumph. There was only the steady cadence of a system doing what it had been built to do when it chose not to look away. Relief did not arrive in a rush. It settled like warmth returning to fingers that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Avery closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and met Cole's gaze, a small nod passing between them. Maya exhaled, shoulders easing by a fraction. Ruth pressed her lips together, the way people do when they have held something too long, and finally set it down. Hank remained standing for a beat, as if waiting for the words to change their meaning. When they did not, he sat. Outside, the yellow light fell across the steps, turning the snow into something almost tender. The townspeople filtered out in quiet groups, no cheers, no declarations, just a shared sense that something right had been done without needing to be celebrated. A child left a drawing taped crookedly to the bulletin board. A woman adjusted a scarf around another's neck. Cole stepped into the cold with Willow at his side. She leaned briefly into his leg, not as a display, but as a fact, and he rested his hand against the warm plane of her shoulder. "We're not finished," he murmured. She flicked one ear, as if agreeing with the part of the sentence that mattered. They drove to the shelter under a sky that had begun to clear, stars testing their brightness against the dark. Northlight Shelter was small, more intention than infrastructure, but tonight it felt like a harbor. Avery met them at the door, sleeves already rolled, the familiar scent of antiseptic and hay threading the air. Inside, the puppies stirred in their warmed enclosure, tiny bodies pressed together, breath making a small weather of its own. Cole watched as Willow approached, careful, lowered herself beside them, and exhaled. The room seemed to breathe with her. There was no triumph in it, only the simple continuity of a life choosing to remain. Later, when the lights were dimmed and the paperwork finished, Cole stood outside for a moment, letting the cold remind him of what the night had asked and what they had answered. The town's yellow light shone through the shelter windows, steady against the dark. It did not promise that everything would be easy. It did not need to. It promised only that when the choice came, again and again, there would be hands willing to keep the door open. He went back inside. Willow was awake, eyes following him with the same quiet certainty that had brought her to his cabin in a storm. He knelt, resting his forehead briefly against the cool of the wall, and allowed himself a single, unguarded thought. This is how it begins, not with noise, but with staying. The first thing Cole changed was the light. He replaced the harsh bulb over the porch with a softer fixture that cast a steady amber across the snow, not to announce anything, but to make the night feel navigable. Then he built the fence, low, wide-gated, more invitation than barrier, so that what had begun as a refuge could learn to be a place of return. Northlight Sanctuary was not a grand name for a modest cabin on a ridge, but names, he had learned, were promises you made to yourself before you made them to anyone else. Avery Quinn came up the hill most mornings in the first weeks, her tall frame wrapped in a parka the color of winter sky, her dark hair braided tight against the wind. She moved through the space with the quiet authority of someone whose care was as methodical as it was compassionate. Infrared heat lamps positioned, so warmth did not startle. A vaccination schedule pinned to the corkboard, bowls set so water would not freeze. Enrichment puzzles rotated so minds stayed busy while bodies healed. She spoke little when work was needed and laughed easily when it was not, the kind of woman who understood that recovery was not a straight line but a series of small, faithful circles. The puppies grew into themselves the way all living things do when they are allowed to, without spectacle, with an inevitability that felt like grace. Spruce, dark-eyed and deliberate, took to the gate as if it were a vocation, sitting squarely whenever anyone approached, not with aggression but with the seriousness of a sentinel who had decided that presence itself was protection. Maple, the smallest of the four, never lost her talent for mischief. If there was a boot, she would find it, carry it with a triumph entirely out of proportion to its weight, and drop it at Cole's feet as if to say, "I have saved this for you." Cedar, all angles and curiosity, learned every corner of the property, Nose mapping the world in a language only he could read, while Aspen, always closest to Willow, followed her mother's shadow with the devotion of a tide to the moon. Willow herself changed in ways that were visible and not. Her coat regained its depth, the black and sable catching light again, the old lines at her neck fading beneath new fur. The bandage came off her leg, replaced by a cautious strength that returned not all at once, but in increments she seemed to measure against the wind. She had a habit of stopping at the edge of the clearing and lifting her muzzle, tasting the air with a focus that was neither fear nor restlessness. Cole called it counting the weather. He learned to trust it. If she paused, he paused. If she turned, he followed. The sanctuary took its rhythm from her. People began to arrive. Not in crowds, Northlight was not built for that, but in careful intervals. A woman who had lost a dog to the cold years before and could not pass the fence without stopping. A father who brought his son to help refill the water troughs. A Sunday teacher who asked if she could bring her class one afternoon to learn what care looked like when it was chosen. Cole did not advertise. He did not need to. Word traveled the way it always had in small places. On boots, in kitchens, along the lines between what had happened and what could happen again if no one paid attention. He kept a board by the door where Avery wrote schedules and notes. On one line, in a hand that pretended to be stern and was not, she had added, "Teach Maple to stop stealing shoes. Priority, very high." Cole circled it and wrote "Impossible" beside it. The board became a ledger of both work and laughter. One afternoon, when the snow had retreated to the shadows and the earth showed through in dark, honest patches, Willow did not come when called. Cole found her at the far edge of the property, standing still, body angled toward the valley, ears pricked not at any sound he could hear. He walked to her side, the air smelling of meltwater and pine. "What is it?" he asked, half to her, half to the space she was reading. She did not move. A minute passed, then another. Down below, a truck appeared on the road, slowed, then turned off at a place that had not been a turn before. Cole felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition. Willow finally looked back at him, amber eyes steady. The moment passed without explanation, but it left behind a question that did not go away. What did she know that he did not? The answer arrived months later when winter loosened its grip and the town held its annual thaw festival by the lake. It was a modest affair, booths with soup and bread, children dragging sleds they no longer needed, a brass band that never quite found the same tempo twice. Cole had not planned to go. Crowds still made something in him close, a reflex that belonged to a life he no longer lived but could not entirely set down. Avery insisted, pressing a thermos into his hands. "You can't protect a place you never step into," she said. Willow trotted beside him through the gathering, spruce and cedar on leads, maple zigzagging like a ribbon in the wind, aspen glued to Willow's flank. People smiled, some waved. A few reached out and stopped themselves, asking first, learning that permission was a kind of respect. They were near the shore when Willow stiffened, not the alert of a guard dog, not the curiosity of a hunter, something sharper, cleaner. She moved forward with a decisiveness that parted the small knots of people without urgency, but without hesitation either. Cole felt the tug on the lead and followed, his body remembering what it meant to trust a signal. At the water's edge, the ice had thinned into a treacherous skin, translucent where winter had lost its argument, but not yet its hold. A boy stood there, perhaps 8 years old, his red hat too big for his head, peering down at the dark beneath the surface. Before anyone could speak, Willow surged, not into the water, but across the narrow strip of shoreline, placing herself between the child and the ice with a precision that felt like intention. She barked once, a single commanding sound that cut through the chatter. The boy startled, stepped back, and the ice gave way where his foot had been. It did not swallow him because he was no longer there. Everything that followed happened in a narrow corridor of time. A shout, a rush, a pair of arms scooping the boy up, a ripple spreading across the broken skin of the lake. The child's mother, small, dark-haired, her face pale with a fear that had not yet found words, clutched him to her chest, hands shaking, tears arriving without ceremony. Cole knelt, his own hand steadying because steadiness was what the moment required. Willow stood, chest heaving, eyes on the water as if counting what had almost been taken. When the boy finally found his breath and looked at her, she lowered her head just enough to meet his gaze. There was no triumph in it, only presence. The town did not make a spectacle of the moment. It did not need to. Stories, when they are true, do not require embellishment. By evening, the mayor had asked Avery about the sanctuary. By the end of the week, the council had placed an item on the agenda: winter welfare guidelines for animals, windbreaks, unfrozen water, emergency checks during storms. A fund followed, small at first, then steadier, for building proper shelters and distributing heated bowls. Cole watched it unfold with the quiet awe of someone who had seen how little it sometimes took to begin a change and how much it took to keep one. Spring settled in with a patience that felt earned. The puppies grew long in the leg, their voices deepening into something that could one day become authority or joy, depending on how it was answered. Spruce remained the gatekeeper, Maple the thief, Cedar the explorer, Aspen the shadow. Willow kept counting the wind. On the board by the door, Avery added a new line. Beneath the old joke about shoes: Lake Festival, incident report closed. Outcome: prevention. Cole drew a small star beside it, a symbol he had once used on maps to mark a safe route. The sanctuary did not become famous. It became something better, dependable. There were nights when Cole still woke before dawn, the quiet pressing against him in ways he had not chosen. On those mornings, he would step onto the porch and let the cold touch his face, grounding him in the present. Willow would come to his side without being called, her breath a warm cloud in the chill, her body a fact that did not require explanation. He had once believed that vigilance was a posture you held against the world. Now he was learning that it could also be a way of standing with it. The light over the porch would glow, the low fence would hold, and the sanctuary would do what it had been built to do: remain. The courthouse looked smaller in summer. Without snow stacked against its steps, without breath fogging the air, it seemed almost modest, a building that knew its power did not come from size. Cole arrived early, as he always did when something mattered, the habit of preparedness still written into the way he stood and waited. The morning light slipped across the square in long, pale bands, warming stone that had held winter for too long. Willow walked at his side on a loose lead, her stride confident now, her coat restored to its deep black and sable sheen. Where once there had been guarded pain in her movement, there was now a measured assurance, the kind that comes not from forgetting, but from choosing to remain present anyway. Spruce trotted behind them, no longer a puppy, his posture already that of a watchful assistant, eyes tracking doors and corners with an attentiveness that felt like vocation rather than instinct. Inside, the room gathered itself for a final decision. Avery Quinn sat near the aisle, tall and composed, her dark hair braided neatly down her back, a folder resting on her lap with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to carry facts the way others carried prayer. Maya Ortiz stood near the clerk's desk, posture straight, dark eyes calm, the expression of a woman who believed in process not because it was flawless, but because it was the best instrument we had for making care durable. Ruth Calder sat 2 rows back, hands folded, face softened by time, and something like relief. The townspeople filled the remaining chairs quietly, not as spectators, but as witnesses. When Hank Doolin entered, he looked smaller than he had in the bar months before. The weight he carried now was not bravado, but consequence. His shoulders sloped inward, his jaw shadowed by a beard that had grown without attention. There was no fire in his eyes, only the dullness of someone who had been forced to sit with what he had avoided for too long. The judge took the bench without ceremony. She had aged, perhaps only in the way responsibility leaves its mark, lines at the corners of her eyes, a steadiness that suggested not fatigue, but resolve. "We are here to determine permanent custody and conditions," she said. "This court has reviewed the evaluations, the compliance reports, the medical records, and the testimony. Today, we conclude." Maya presented the summary in a voice that did not seek persuasion. Willow's recovery, the puppy's development, the sanctuary standards, the town's updated welfare guidelines, the absence of any credible plan from Hank that could ensure safety. Avery spoke briefly to the animal's progress. Vaccinations complete, weight restored, behavioral assessments stable. She did not embellish. She did not need to. The facts stood on their own. Hank was offered the chance to speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He said only that he had not known how bad it had been until it was too late, that the bottle had made his world smaller than it should have been. His words were not eloquent. They were not enough to undo what had been done, but they were not empty either. The room did not judge them for what they were not. It simply held them. In the pause before the ruling, Willow did something she had not done since the temporary hearing. She stepped forward, not to the front of the room, but to the narrow space between Cole and the bench, and sat. Not as a plea, not as a display. As if to say, "I am here. I have learned what safety feels like. Do not make me unlearn it." Cole's breath caught for a moment. He did not move. The judge looked at Willow, then at Cole, then at the papers before her. A silence gathered, thick, expectant, almost intimate. It was the kind of quiet that makes a room remember what it is for. The judge's voice, when it came, was clear. "This court grants permanent custody of the canine known as Willow and her offspring to Northlight. Sanctuary under the supervision of Dr. Avery Quinn. The respondent, Hank Doolin, is prohibited from owning or possessing animals for a period of 5 years and is ordered to participate in a court-approved rehabilitation program and complete community service related to animal welfare." There was no gavel strike that felt like victory. There was only the sound of words becoming structure. Cole did not exhale until the sentence had finished. Avery closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Maya's shoulders eased, just enough to register the moment without claiming it. Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth, not to hide tears, but to hold them in a shape that felt like gratitude. Outside, the town did not erupt. It never had. What followed was quieter and therefore more enduring. Conversations that began with, "We should," hands that reached for one another in small, practical ways. By afternoon, 3 of the puppies had found their people, not strangers, but neighbors who had already learned their names, their habits, their softness. Cedar went with the teacher who had brought her class to the sanctuary. His curiosity would be answered by a life of books, trails, and patient instruction. Aspen went with the woman who had once lost a dog to the cold, the bond formed not from replacement, but from recognition. Maple, still mischievous, still irrepressible, went home with a family that laughed when she stole their slippers and loved her for it, understanding that some habits were not to be corrected so much as redirected. Spruce remained. It felt less like a decision and more like the natural conclusion of a question that had been asked since the fence had first been built. He took his place at Willow's side, as if the role had been waiting for him all along. They returned to the cabin as evening settled, the air carrying the scent of pine and thawed earth. Cole climbed the ladder and hung the new porch light he had purchased weeks before, a simple fixture with a warm glow. He wired it carefully, the movements of his hands steady, deliberate, the way they had always been when something mattered. When he switched it on, the light pooled across the threshold and spilled onto the path beyond the low fence. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. Willow stood beside him, ears pricked, the soft fur along her neck lifting in the breeze. He thought of all the nights he had spent believing that vigilance meant preparing for what might come to take something away. He was learning now that it could also mean preparing for what might arrive, needing a place to stay. Inside, the sanctuary breathed with the quiet of contentment. The bowls were full. The floor was clean. The board by the door still carried Avery's handwriting, though some of the notes had been crossed out with a smile. On the top line, in Cole's careful block letters, was a single word: remain, not as a command, as a promise. He poured water into the kettle and watched steam rise, thinking of the long arc from a night at 15 below to this moment where nothing needed to be defended because everything that mattered had already been named and placed. At dawn, he stepped onto the porch with a mug in his hands. The horizon held the last of winter in pale bands, but the earth beneath was dark and ready. Willow lay near the threshold, Spruce curled beside her, their breathing slow and even. The light above them glowed steadily, turning frost into something that looked almost like honey. Cole stood there longer than he meant to, not because he was waiting for anything, but because he was learning what it meant to stay without bracing for loss. The past did not disappear. It never did. But it loosened its grip, becoming something that could be carried without cutting. Maple returned that morning with a small ceremony of her own. She trotted up the steps, placed a single slipper, rescued from somewhere she should not have been, precisely in front of the door, and sat. Her head tilted, eyes bright, as if asking whether this, at last, was correct. Cole laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease. "You got it," he said softly. Willow watched, tail thumping once against the boards, a punctuation that felt like agreement. In that small, ordinary moment, the story found its true ending, not in law or light or even rescue, but in the quiet understanding of what a home is when it has been chosen, defended, and finally allowed to be simply what it is. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or flashing lights. Sometimes they come on 4 tired paws in the coldest hour, carrying a quiet message that heaven still notices, the ones the world forgets. A door opens, a heart stays awake, and what looked like too late becomes right on time. If God can turn a blizzard night into a beginning, then He can also meet you in the ordinary places of your life. In a hard morning, a lonely lunch table, a worried doctor's visit, a phone call you've been afraid to make, a kindness you almost didn't offer. Grace often looks like something small that you choose anyway. So if this story reminded you that love is not just a feeling, but a decision, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what moment touched your heart the most. And if you want more stories of courage, compassion, and second chances, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you and your family, strengthen the weary, heal the hurting, protect the vulnerable, and guide every heart still searching for light. Amen.